Welcome to Common Table Conversations. My name is Tamos. I'm an Episcopal priest currently in the Anglican Church of Canada, working for the United Church of Canada, resourcing congregations and individuals for mission. I'm the coordinator of the Innovative Ministry Center, as well as the head of a project called ChurchX, which is an online education and community hub. ChurchX provides online space for judicatories, seminaries, and even individual scholars to host courses, networks, and events. I'm passionate about breaking down the barriers that separate and fragment the communities that support congregations and clergy. And so I love the work that Common Table is doing in that regard. I'll be your host today. Today, we'll hear from Helen Blier, who will begin serving as the director of the Center for Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary in October. Helen also serves as the president of ALLLM, which is A, 3 L's and an M, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry. Say it 10 times fast. I challenge you. To get things started, I know we all just say ALLLM, So to get things started, I'll just say, welcome, Helen. We look forward to your presentation.
And thanks, Thad, for the invitation to share some of the research work that ALLLM has been doing over the last couple of years. So going to our first slide, for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, the name of it is ALLLM. We've got some deep roots. We go back about 50 years during the heyday of growth and innovation in theological schools and ecclesial bodies. So think about the 1970s. There's a growth in interest in church. There are all sorts of denominations that are opening up pathways to ordination for people who had historically not been part of leadership in churches. There was a flush time there for theological schools. This is when what was originally called SOCM was established. We're a network of theological educators, program directors, program designers, and advocates for continuing education for those who do ministry, both ordained and lay. Our mission is to explore the needs of the ecumenical church and to explore as well trends in continuing education for church leaders. Our membership has largely tracked with the ups and downs of both church and seminary trends. And in 2019, during what I might call one of the nodes of these episodes, ALLLM leadership gathered to discern what people in the industry needed. And we realized that the landscape of the work that we were doing had changed so much. We needed to figure out what was going on in lifelong learning before we could begin to respond appropriately to it. Because a real map of the work and where it was happening had not been conducted in several decades. So we decided to fill that gap and designed a very nice, elegant 3-tier project that would look at what was going on in lifelong learning in theological schools, in judicatories, so church bodies, and in freestanding centers like retreat centers and parachurch organizations. It seems like it's stating the obvious, but we knew we could not serve the constituency without first getting a sense of what was going on among them. So our first step, as you can see on the slide, was to design a survey to be sent to all of the ATS member schools with lifelong learning programs. We were ready to go in the beginning months of 2020, and well, you know the rest of the story. 2020 happened. And the survey is as far as we got with that research proposal. So spoiler alert, the information I'm going to be sharing with you from that survey today was absolute gold because it gives us a great baseline for what lifelong learning looked like at a major inflection point. And we've got a proposal together. In fact, my research partner, Daryl Stevens, is in the room today. We want to complete the study, which also would include an update to the original survey. So of the 273 member schools in the Association of Theological Schools at the time, we found some kind of lifelong learning programming in about 86 of them, so like a quarter-ish of them, a little bit more than that. And we received responses from 67 of those schools. Our survey was divided into 5 sections, and it inquired about program content as well as financial and institutional structures. It inquired about directors and the work that they did, and it inquired about these directors' perceptions about the mission, vocation, and future of their programs. So for our time together today, I'm just going to be dipping into a couple of those little data areas. One of them is the directors and the work that they do, and the director perceptions about mission, vocation, and the future of their programs. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about any other insights from the data. I'm going to have Tay go ahead and put my direct email address, my personal one, before my CTS one is activated in the chat so that you can reach out to me. So next slide, a few hot takes to start with. First of all, as those of you who do lifelong learning in the room know, we are amazing. We are smart, we're resilient, and we know how to work with pretty streamlined conditions. 36 out of the 67 respondents have doctorates, and most operate their programs while holding hyphenated job descriptions or with minimal staff and financial support. One respondent said that running the program was 1/6 of their portfolio. So they were running a whole program on about 6 to 7 hours a week total. Now, as you know, there's no such thing as part-time work in either church or academy, so it's likely that their responsibilities went beyond that. But it does give you a pretty good sense of how the institution wanted to support and value the work that respondent was doing. Number two, COVID turned out to be a boon for lifelong learning programs. It was kind of amazing. I expected to hear tales from the crypt. Instead, I had people responding that their programming and their attendance at the programs stayed level or grew during the pandemic, and all but 4 programs pivoted online. Those 4 programs basically folded during the pandemic, and we don't know what's happened to them since, but we'll of course find out when we do our follow-up study. What was super interesting for me, and something that I was living through as well as a program director, was the speed with which programs could respond to this fairly unforeseen and emergent circumstance. There's a lot of nimbleness baked into these programs. Number 3, as we'll see, Thad Austin and Katie Camo's Clergy well-being study resonates quite a bit with these results. Despite clear strengths, what we saw was evidence of fractures in 3 particular areas: between constituent needs and the programs that were offered by these programs, between lifelong learning leaders and their institutional leadership, and among the leaders themselves. This is the key point that I want to lift up today, given the effort that we have to convene, connect, and cohere groups of people doing this clergy well-being work. So now that we've set the table, let's break up into some small groups and check in with each other. So our next slide has 2 questions that I'd like you guys to address. As you prepare to go into your breakout groups, consider the following questions to guide your conversation. I see that we have a variety of people in the room. Some of you are serving in theological schools and in judicatories or other providers of lifelong learning. Others of you are practitioners, and we seem to also have a 3rd category of people who are providing support in other ways. Use these 2 questions to guide your conversation. If you serve in a place that offers lifelong learning, what does it look like? And secondly, if you're a practitioner, where do you go for lifelong learning to refresh your vocation or hone your skills? Thanks so much, Tay. Here's what I'd like you guys to do. I'm hoping you had some good conversation in your small groups. What I'd like you to do is to drop into the chat pod. It's the icon for that is at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. Something that one of your group mates said that caught your attention. So just drop something into the pod that one of your group mates said that caught your attention. Resourcing missionaries for continuing education, the importance of secular lifelong learning resources. Duke Divinity School's study leave for ministry professionals. This is something I hear over and over again. And vocational sustenance, sustainability over time really emphasizes the need to take Sabbath from the work that one's doing. I'm sure many of you have read Alex Lang's viral essay this past week on why he was leaving the pastorate. This is a rising star in the PCUSA who was at a tall steeple church and seemed to be on top of his game, and he is just tapping out completely. And a lot of folks have had responses to it, but it does seem that the ability to do lifelong learning, where you pull out, reflect on things, and then reinsert yourself into the ministry context, whether it in an episodic way on a short timeline or once every couple of years as a Sabbath kind of thing, is really important. Great stuff here. Let's take a look at program content areas from the ATS Mapping the Workforce study. Now, you're probably going to say, Helen, I thought you were going to be sharing ALLLM research. This is not ALLLM research. Well, that's because I do a lot of work with my research partners at ATS, the Association of Theological Schools, and they regularly collect information from alums of ATS member schools to ask about their perceived satisfaction with their education and what they're doing professionally. The data here are from 2017. They update the survey every 5 years, but they put the 2022 revision on hold due to the pandemic, and they're in the process of doing the update right now. In any case, there's probably not much reason to believe that the numbers would change significantly. I've looked at the Brown-May study, which dates back to the early 1930s, about perceived satisfaction of seminary education among Methodist clergy. And the results, I mean, you can kind of say it was ever thus. The idea that the classic disciplines are excellently taught in seminary, but the practical arts are not, and they end up being more important, has been a consistent theme for the last almost 100 years of ministry education, which I think is great marching orders for us, those of us who do continuing education. Anyways, take a look at these two charts here. The particular question asked alums to identify the competencies they used at work, which is that blue column on the left, and then to identify what they wish they had learned in seminary, the yellow greenish column on the right. So the top 20 competencies that they use on the job, we've got preaching, administration, pastoral care, and counseling. None of this should be a surprise. I do find it a little surprising that liturgics and worship find itself so far down on the list, but hey, who knows why that should be the case. But these top ones, these all have to do with a kind of public arts performance aspect of the job, including HR and business management kinds of things. So when you go over to the right and you look at what people wish they had learned, the number 2 thing that they use at work is the number 1 thing they wish they had learned, administration. They've got leadership on here, finances. I mean, simply how to read something like a spreadsheet, theology, pastoral care, counseling, ministry. I find it odd that somebody would say they wish they had learned theology in seminary, but we're just going to leave that one there. But you can see that there are things people wish they had learned in seminary. This makes people who are academic deans kind of nervous because they're already stretched in terms of trying to fit everything into a curriculum for a degree program that will adequately prepare people. I think this is a great entry point for schools to begin to say, hey, how can lifelong learning programs come alongside degree programs and continue to prepare people with just-in-time education that allows them to function competently and confidently in the work that they do? Plus, lifelong learning is one of the keys to a vibrant ministry over time. So as you take a look at these 2 lists, besides the couple of things that I've pointed out, are there any other things that you would like to point out or notice and hold up for our observation? If there's anything you want to point out, once again, drop it into the chat pod. I do find conflict resolution to be an interesting addition to the column on the right. Now, as we move on with the rest of our presentation, one of the things that I'd like you to think of is that greenish yellow chart on the right-hand side of your screen is something that kind of gives lifelong learning programs some marching orders. It gives a good metric for how program directors should be thinking about the resourcing that they intend to do. And Tay, thanks. Yeah, I wonder if tech is going to show up too. So this is 2017. This is before the pandemic. I have a hunch too that conflict resolution is going to come higher on that list, and tech is going to be one of the things as well. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Now, going to the next slide, the survey that we sent out asked program directors to identify the primary content areas of the opportunities they offer. It's a quick metric to see whether lifelong learning programs are aligned with pastor needs, that yellow-green chart on the previous slide. So are they aligned? Well, kind of yes and no. Leadership development is a really broad category. I think in a rebooted survey, we might slice that out a little bit more and specify what kinds of things constitute leadership development. Anecdotally, in a post-survey scan of programs, we found that most programs address clergy as leaders in a kind of generalized way, or the problems or identity issues that come up as leaders. But few of the programs address some of the more granular topics identified on that yellow-green chart, like conflict resolution, HR, finances, and the like. In short, the content areas that you see here on the screen really align for the most part with dominant patterns in seminary curricula. So ATS member schools are kind of offering more of the same, if you will, in their lifelong learning programs. So it does raise interesting questions about whether clergy leaders' needs would find a responsive home in the programs that your shop offers. I'll be interested to see if post-COVID, this particular list shifts at all, the programs that are being offered when we rerun the survey. Now let's go to the next slide and take a look at the perceptions lifelong learning leaders have of their work and vocation. So we've got 3 word clouds we're going to consider. This first image summarizes responses to the question, what are the growing edges of your program? If you've never seen a word cloud before, the larger the font size of the word, the more frequently it appeared in their responses. What I'd like you to do is to drop into the chat words that really leap out at you from this word cloud. What do you see? Online, yeah. Spanish, this is huge. Taking note of the places where church is growing, as much as people are clutching their pearls about the decline of the church, they're not looking at the growth of the church in non-English speaking and non-white dominant contexts. So introducing programs that address where church is actually growing is an interesting growth edge. Leadership, audience, online, formation, development. I love the word engaging. When I take a look at this, I really see the preponderance of these words really moving towards learner-centered rather than instructor-centered education that focuses on formation rather than trying to fill in gaps with perceived deficits. A lot of the models folks have for education focuses on where people's perceived needs are, where they are lacking. And so the school or the institution swoops in like the great savior to provide those needs. A learner-centered education focuses on the competencies of the learner and seeks to grow from a positive orientation, what folks already have. Let's take a look at the next word cloud. The second image asked them early in the pandemic what they thought their program would look like in 5 years. Again, plop into the chat what leaps out at you. What do you see? Before the, before the real sort of longitudinal impact of the pandemic was upon them, they have online as that #1 word. I see words that are very positive in orientation, that look forward, that point to innovation, to relationships, the need to respond to an environment that is changing rapidly, rather than being reactive to it. In many ways, lifelong learning programs are perfectly positioned to be the leading edge of formation and education efforts because they're not as weighted down by a bureaucratic or institutional structure as, say, curricular revisions or ordination requirements. If you're at a school and you've lived through a curriculum revision, it is not for the faint of heart. So lifelong learning programs can work nimbly, think sailboat versus cruise liner, cooperatively with some of these necessary entities like curricula and institutional structures to help respond and pivot. Next, our third slide asks leaders, what do you need in order to thrive in your position? These responses hit really close to home. What became very clear is the overwhelming experience among most leaders that they did not have what they needed in order to live into this anticipated future we saw in the previous word cloud. Most identified their programs as fringe, as shoestring, the addenda to the real work of the host institution, and they rarely had the resources they needed to do it effectively and without stress, while at the same time seeing it as crucial to the well-being of their constituents. To this end, I do wonder how closely their experiences mirror those of the clergy they intend to serve. Kind of a fractal reality here. Let's take a look now at the next chart. This Likert chart amplifies this perspective. Respondents were asked about their perceptions regarding their institution's support and recognition of their work and their own felt importance of that work. A Likert scale asks you to rate on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being least agreement or strongly disagreeing, 5 being strongest agreement. And people tend to inflate and soft pedal their responses. So if you see anything below a 4, it's usually worth your attention, because 3, that middle point, is kind of a meh response. You'll see that the overwhelming majority of institutional responses here is meh. Like, yeah, they kind of affirm the importance. They kind of see lifelong learning as integral to the mission of the organization. But when asked about their personal sense of vocation and the importance of the work, these responses are mostly in the 4s, except for the last curveball I threw in there just to make sure they weren't just like blindly putting numbers in. I have concerns re the future of this work at my organization. People kind of disagreed with that. They said, yeah, our institution's going to continue to support it, but you can tell that there is a desire for greater support. The institution doesn't, on the whole, seem to mirror the director's sense of importance, and this might contribute to some of the unpredictability they name when trying to imagine their program 5 years out. So, looking at the next slide, lifelong learning leaders don't appear to be supported well in their institutions, particularly theological schools, do not seem to be structuring these offices and positions in a way that both reflects the perceived importance of the work and supports their sustainability over time. I can't tell you how many people I hear from who say, yeah, lifelong learning was set up to be a cash cow for the rest of the institution, which is a completely unsustainable mission from the get-go. And we could have a whole other conversation about that. But 3/4 of the people who lead these offices have other additional institutional responsibilities. 9 out of 10 have some access to professional development, but 2/3 of them simply can't take sabbatical because they don't have time. And additional support included things like space and permission, encouragement, the tacit support that learning is valued. But people said, yeah, I think they'd support me, but it's not in a standard quantified way. The intention is good, but the responsibilities and time constraints really limit the ability to use benefits. So even though they're supporting lifelong learning, few of them had the opportunity to actually do lifelong learning as directors, which is ironic to say the least. Now let's take a look at these 2 questions we've got for our next round of breakout rooms. Question 1, We'll skip to the next slide then. What struck you most in the previous data? And number two, what one or two questions about lifelong learning were sparked for you today and will stay with you after you log off today? So earlier in the presentation, I talked about the fragmentation that's evident in lifelong learning programs and their leaders. We saw evidence of disconnect between constituent needs and programs, between institutional support and program needs. And increasingly, we are seeing a lack of connection among the leaders themselves. Like solo pastors, they're often singletons in their contexts, and they typically don't have the resources or opportunity to connect with others who do this kind of work. This is something that Sarah brought up in the chat if you scroll up through the chat pod. So this is a gap that ALLLM, shameless promotion, is stepping into. First of all, we're modeling partnership by working actively with other organizations committed to clergy preparation, education, and well-being, like Common Table, like Association of Theological Schools, like Wabash, Intrust Center for Theological Schools, and other partners. Number two, we've received some grant funding, very generous grant funding, to convene some gatherings among lifelong learning leaders to connect with each other and begin to articulate three things: a shared sense of vocational identity in a very disparate work field, best practices for the leaders themselves, and best practices in program design. And as I mentioned earlier, we are revisiting the research. This is absolutely crucial. The global pandemic that began in 2020 was a major turning point for everyone, including those of us involved in all aspects of church, leading, educating, forming. We want to see if some of the responsiveness that was reported by lifelong learning leaders has been sustained, and how and whether institutions have increased their support for these efforts. Number two, the recent Pathways to Ministry initiative funded by the Lilly Endowment's religion arm, which some of you may be aware of, provided 105 theological schools with grants of $1 to $1.5 million. 51 of these programs have incorporated some kind of lifelong learning or non-degree education into their grant projects. Those of us who do this work, of course, couldn't be more delighted to see the rest of the world beginning to affirm the importance of something we're already committed to. However, what we're finding is that there are a lot of deer caught in headlights in new leadership in these programs. They are the dogs that caught the car. Like, oh my gosh, if $1.5 million, we got to develop a program, what do we do? So we're trying to step into that space and walk with new leadership to develop sustainable programs that meet their missional needs. Number three, as we think about new models for learning and growth, we affirm that formation is a lifelong process, and it's important for us to be strategic and responsive rather than reactive to the changes in the world around us. I'm reminded again of Thad and Katie's research. They write about so many well-intended efforts out there to support clergy well-being, but they also observed that these efforts are fragmented and not supported well. The field of lifelong learning is no different, and ALLLM wants to use this research and our convened gatherings as a way to create a coherent narrative in support of this work, and to provide opportunities for leaders to see themselves in this bigger story, to convene, to connect, and to cohere. In a rapidly changing context, this requires intentionality. When SOCM, the precursor to ALLLM, was first developed in the early 1970s, we could assume a certain amount of predictable homogeneity in clergy training programs and clergy support services. That is no longer the story. And so we have to make the case for the importance of this work and develop intentional connection opportunities rather than just assuming they are there or that people understand the importance of this work. So I'm going to end with a pitch. As you'll see on the very last slide, if you're a leader or provider of continuing education or other lifelong learning support for ministry, join us at ALLLM. We're committed to articulating and supporting a shared sense of vocational identity and articulating these best practices for leaders and programs. Plus, we are a lot of fun. So If that doesn't win you over, I'm not sure what will. If we go to the previous slide, I'm going to give the final words to Dan Aylshire, who's the former executive director of ATS. He recently wrote a book on the future of theological education in the Theological Education Between the Times series produced by Ted Smith at Emory University. This is taken from an article he wrote in Interest magazine. He talks about the times changing and the professional model of theological education won't necessarily be as good in the next century as it was in the last one. Theological education, if it is to be good for the future, as past versions were for an earlier day, must change. People often mistake the degree programs, the container in which we hold theological education, for the goal itself. Our mission is to form leadership for faith-based communities. The degree program is simply one avenue for doing this. And the increasing importance of lifelong learning programs is as an alternative pathway, or a pathway that comes alongside degree programs to help ensure that ministry for a rapidly changing world, a job itself that has many costume changes and many different iterations, is adequate, that the preparation for this is adequate for the folks who are doing this work. To that end, ATS's new accreditation standards have a new standard, 3.5, which gives all of us a mandate. The school has to demonstrate an understanding of learning and formation as lifetime pursuits. Lifelong learning is now baked into the standards, so there will be no shortage of interest in the programs that we run moving forward. Now, Tay, over to you to moderate the Q&A section.
Right. Thank you very much, Helen. That was great. I mean, this is so interesting to see, ideas that some of us have had just from being in the field and stuff actually like proven out, right? And then refined and adjusted and so on with actual empirical data. So thank you very much to you and your collaborators for their hard work on doing that. So we have some time for some questions. There have been a few that have been thrown up in the chat, as well as some that might just be rattling around in your heads out there. So I'm going to start with one that that actually put in, which I think is interesting. It says, Helen, you mentioned that what providers of lifelong learning are offering is, quote, more of the same. Their instruction mirror what is already offered in the seminary. What do you make of that?
I think that because they're located within a theological school, and a theological school has a certain educational logic to it, they're going to be mirroring what what would be considered appropriate education for the host context. Additionally, a lot of these programs, as we saw in other parts of the research, are relying on in-house faculty to actually serve as educators in the program, to serve as teaching leadership. So if you got a bunch of church historians and theologians on staff as faculty, you are going to be using those same people. I think that as an industry, theological schools tend to be fairly risk averse. I won't quite call it allergic, but I don't think that we can say theological schools on the whole are used to innovation and out there kinds of thinking. So what we have seen is that the programs themselves tend to be a little bit more conservative. This is in most of the schools. And it's so interesting because when you ask pastors themselves what they want more of, they'll say things like theology and spirituality and preaching. And it could be because in the midst of the anxiety that is obviously the result of a completely tumultuous and often chaotic context within which many of them are working, they're going back to comfort food as a way to nourish themselves, not necessarily develop new skills, but to reconnect themselves to their sense of vocation and the stuff they fell in love with when they were originally in the training program. This is just a hunch I have. My primary area of research and study is actually vocation, so this is something that really interests me. But if you think about it, when times are challenging and everything seems new, you want to go back to something that feels familiar and comforting for yourself.
That's a very good insight. I would add to it that I think also it's returning to communities that they found nourishing. I mean, the best prayer life I had in my life probably was when I was in seminary. And I think a lot of people would say that he went through seminary, right? Because you go to chapel every day, multiple times a day often, and you're praying with all your buddies, so definitely, I think it's also the return to the community. So an interesting correlation to run would be whether asynchronous programs have the same kind of appeal for kind of the traditional content versus the synchronous stuff where people have a sense of community and engagement, as well as hybrid versus like in person back at the campus. Because for some people, they have that feeling when they return back to the alma mater, right, and they walk into their classroom where, you know, they learned preaching so many years ago. They get that kind of thrill, right? And to what degree is that kind of moderating what the schools then offer would be an interesting kind of, you know, thing. That's a good insight. That's a good insight.
It's actually really interesting too, as it connects to the primary motivation people have for registering for Doctor of Ministry programs, which at the beginning of SOCM was considered a form of continuing education. That the primary motivation is not to get the new letters after your name, but to remember you have a brain, because pastoring often encourages you to forget that, and to get a sense of community, to be part of a cohort, which is why so many programs have issues of people finishing their final projects, because people already got what they really wanted out of the experience, being part of community. Right. So thanks. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, I have tons of questions, but I'm gonna wait to see who else has some things. Does anyone else want to maybe unmute yourselves and ask a question of Helen?
See some folks dropping some questions into the chat pod too. Could do is so Kevin Kennedy has asked if we've seen anything work well to motivate and engage clergy who've been resistant to continuing formation. That's the $900,000 question, Kevin. This is a huge issue. Field of Dreams is a lie. If you build it, they do not necessarily come. And what I have discovered is that the third-party warm handoff is often most successful in encouraging people to do work. A lot of folks say, oh, it's money that keeps me from doing it. If you make programs free, they still don't come. Other people say it's time. I think what they really need is somebody who is in a fiduciary role over the person to tell them, no, this is a priority. We want you to do this because we are invested in you. And then we will provide support for this to happen. I know a number of Presbyterian clergy I work with say that sometimes their sessions will not allow them to do it because they think that the person's time should be exclusively dedicated to the care and feeding of the congregants. That's unfortunately a very short-sighted view. But I do think that having judicatory leaders and mentors reinforce the importance of doing this is one crucial aspect of that. And then, of course, interviewing folks, surveying folks, saying, hey, what do you identify as the barriers? How can we reduce some of those barriers is another really good step.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Yeah, I mean, motivating. I mean, one thing, I mean, there's the carrot and the stick in a way too. I mean, a lot of the programs that I run are mandated. Like, for example, we run, you know, racial justice sort of programs that are actually required. so in that case, you have this interesting opportunity to teach people something about not just racial justice, but about how they can engage their own learning and take responsibility. So they're not just doing what's required, but they can see like, oh yeah, I'm also interested in X, Y, or Z subject. Thank you. Okay, let's pick out some other questions. There was an earlier question, which was, can you help us kind of tease apart the distinction between interpersonal and intrapersonal competencies that seminaries prepare people with?
Yeah, I had written that one down because, Mark, I saw that you dropped that into the chat. Interpersonal has to do with between people. Intrapersonal is self-awareness, dealing with yourself. So a lot of folks think that the work of ministry is something that extends from the tip of the nose outward, when we all know that spiritual and emotional maturity are absolutely crucial to functioning as a responsible boundary-keeping pastor.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's see if we can pick out some more questions. Yeah, I mean, one thing that hasn't come up so far is the role of lifelong learning directors in shaping institutional culture at their parent institutions, and how within academia often there's a status sort of game that's played, and frankly, I know a lot of lifelong directors do not feel like they're very high on that totem pole in their related institutions, and like, yeah. So how can that be? You know, what is the responsibility? I mean, a lot of that is something that you just can't change as a director of lifelong learning necessarily, but maybe there's soft power, maybe there's sort of other ways. I mean, any thoughts about that, Helen?
Just briefly, what Tay was asking about was how to remedy the problem that a lot of folks who do this work, the leadership of these lifelong learning programs, are kind of low people on the totem pole in the hierarchy that is both church world and academia. And in other places, in fact, if you go to intrust.org, you'll see that I've done a couple of webinars and podcasts there. Intrust's constituency is mostly top-level administration and boards in theological schools. And the work I've done there is to articulate for top-level administrators and boards some of the changes they need to make in things like governance structure, bylaws, and the structuring and support of these jobs within the ecosystem of the institution to adequately recognize the fact that lifelong learning programs are a major provider of the educational mission of the institution. So if you're in a theological school, it's not just the degree programs. It is also the lifelong learning program that fulfills the missional mandate to do education. If you're talking about adjudicatory, let's say the PCUSA or the United Methodist Church General Board of Higher Education, or clergy well-being and support, the provision of lifelong learning opportunities and supporting and encouraging that is a major contributor to the ongoing vibrancy and lack of burnout for clergy. So all the folks who are interested in clergy being well and whole and doing their work over time and effectively should be invested in lifelong learning. And as I said, on Intrust, I've made the case for talking points, for example, that you can use in helping to argue that.